Good morning, everybody. I'm Malgorzata Mikucka, and I will be sharing with you yet another research on the link between income inequality and happiness. The idea that income inequality, the idea that income inequality is bad for people's quality of life is appealing to many social scientists. And I'm also convinced that it is also appealing probably to many people in this room. However, when we look into past studies, we learn that for sure we know three things. We know that inequality is good for subjective well-being. We know that inequality harms subjective well-being, and we know that inequality does not matter whatsoever. There is, however, some consensus. Past studies seem to direct us to the idea that this relationship differs across groups of countries. So it seems that in high-income countries, in developed countries, sometimes in Europe, these effects are more negative. In contrast, in poorer countries, in developing countries, there is more evidence of the positive relationship between income inequality and subjective well-being. These are empirical patterns, but importantly, they also nicely align with the ways how we think about the links between inequality and subjective well-being. We may think about various effects. So we may think first about negative effects of income inequality and well-being. So we may think that income inequality negatively affects people's psychological functioning. It induces social comparisons. It makes people perceive injustice and unfairness in their surrounding. We may think that it negatively affects social relationships. It reduces cohesion, limits upward mobility, triggers crime and violence. We may also think that in more unequal contexts, maybe democratic institutions do not function so well and that public investment is low. So there are all these reasons to think about negative effects. Instead, when we think about potential positive effects of income inequality on subjective well-being, our ideas go more towards economy. So we think that in more unequal countries, resources are distributed in more effective ways to those who work hard, who are more talented. We may think that inequality may act as an incentive for people to work hard, to innovate. It may be a precondition for developing new technologies, new businesses. Somehow we think about inequality as a form of promise of opportunity. This is where the term tunnel effect comes in. So summing up past empirical patterns and the way we think about inequality make us believe that in rich countries, people care at least a bit about equality. But in poor countries, high inequality is not a problem as long as we care about the economy. And today, I want to question this statement. Why? For me, there are two main reasons. First of them is the belief that this kind of research comes with various methodological challenges, and sometimes we can do things better. And although it seems this is just a technicality, this is just a detail, I'm convinced it is not, because it actually affects the conclusions that we reach. The second reason is more substantive. So we have growing evidence that growth at all costs in less developed countries is actually harmful for health and well-being. And some of the people contributing to this line of research are today in this room. So my aim, I want to estimate the relationship between income inequality and subjective well-being. I will look separately at high income, low middle income, and transition countries. And I think I'm overcoming some of the limitations of past research. Which limitations are this? The basic limitation are data. And that's obvious in this kind of question, this kind of problem. Here on these graphs, I listed number of countries for which in various survey programs, for which we have information on subjective well-being and on the macro indicators, so the Gini index and GDP. And as you see, World Value Survey stands out nicely, but overall, like it's hardly ever we go above 20 countries in a specific group of countries. For this reason, today I will show you the analysis of data coming from the survey data recycling project. Here you may access their website. They harmonized post-hoc data from 23 international survey projects. So this is tremendous amount of data, tremendous amount of observations. Here I listed the surveys that they covered, and those in black are those that are included in my analysis today. Okay, as you see, with SDR data, my numbers of countries go up. And we may say they are not perfect. I have like 25, 29 countries in some groups, but still it's more than most of the studies, most of other studies. And also that's simply how much data it seems there is. Another type of challenge that we're all facing with similar kind of analysis are modeling challenges. Macro and micro data. Income inequality is defined at the macro level. Subjective well-being is individual characteristics. And many influential papers decide to move and stay at one of these levels. So they do either macro level or micro level analysis, each of them coming with their own constraints. I'm a sociologist. Clearly, I opt for multi-level models in this case. The second question, the second question that we need to answer refers to changes over time versus cross-sectional differences. With this kind of data, so with various countries observed over time, we have more and less unequal countries, and we have periods of higher and lower inequality within countries. Should these two types of variance be pulled together and treated as one, or should they be separate? My point is that they should be separated because they have different meaning. Like we may find different relationships, and we will also interpret them in a different way. That's why I opt for separation of these two types of variance. So I opt for so-called hybrid models. Finally, controls. We know that we need to control for the GDP because more developed countries are more unequal overall. There are also papers advocating for control for time trend in order to address the possible spurious correlation over time. So the fact that two processes may increase independently, but if we don't control for the time trend, we may conclude that they are related. And finally, as I have also individual level data, I also account for very basic individual level controls. I will present to you results of a 3-level cross-classified model. I have individuals nested within country waves, nested within country surveys, and nested within countries. I need all these levels because I have variables defined at each of these levels. The most important for my analysis are the macro factors, so inequality and also the control of GDP. And each of them I include in my model in 2 ways. So first, I have this country level averages, country defined, so variables defined at country level. Their effects will inform me about the differences, time invariant differences between more and less unequal countries. The second component are the deviations from these country-specific averages, which will inform me about the effects of changing inequality within countries. So the difference between periods of high and low inequality within country. I also have very basic individual controls, and I have the methodological controls, which reflect the fact that I'm using all these various surveys, and the questions have been asked there in various ways with various scales and so forth. So I control for that. Okay, so let's look at the results. I'm starting with the coefficients which I consider the most important. So these are the effects of within country changes of income inequality. I run the analysis for happiness and life satisfaction. We see predominantly negative effects, not significant for happiness, significant for life satisfaction in high income countries and in, this is middle and low income countries. So these are the developed countries. So consistently with past studies, we find differences across these 3 groups of countries. Here, the transition countries stand out, but in contrast to past studies, I find no positive effect of changing income inequality in developing countries or anywhere. What about the cross-sectional effects of income inequality? Here you see a different picture. We have like a range of positive and negative effects, not significant for high income countries and for transition countries, and significant and positive for developing countries. Okay, so yeah, first, different effects, then cross-sectional effects differ from the longitudinal ones, and we find positive cross-sectional effects for developing countries. Before I close, here is a look of the effect of the GDP. So we have the effects of within country changes of GDP and the differences between wealthier and poorer countries overall. So we find, in general, rather positive effects, less significant for high income countries when it comes to economic growth, strongest positive effects in transition countries, that's what we know, and some effects also for developing countries. Okay, so we had this distinction between cross-sectional and longitudinal effects. And I think that that's the main input from this paper. That's the main idea around which this paper has been built. How should we think about these 2 types of effects? We may think of it in terms of long and short-term effects. And that's the interpretation that, like, there are 2 papers that did something similar by Martin Schröder. And this is how he writes about it. So he writes about long-term inequality and short-term inequality. According to this interpretation, the changes in inequality are something that people notice. So in periods of increasing inequality, well-being reduces. But in the long run, people get used to high inequality, so they are not negatively affected. So that's with this interpretation, we are only left with the question, why would this long-term effect of inequality be positive in developing countries? The second way how we can think about these two types of effects comes from the dictionary of panel data analysis. So we would say that the analysis over time are free from the effects of time invariant unobserved confounders. So they probably better reflect the real relationship, the true relationship, whereas these cross-sectional effects also show the are confounded by unobservables, by unobservable differences across countries. And in our case, in case of developing countries, that would be some factors which are positively correlated with high inequality and positively correlated with high subjective well-being. So there might be some third factors building this relationship. The question, which factors could it be, for the moment, is to my knowledge, not yet answered. Okay, summing up, the positive link between income inequality and subjective well-being that past studies demonstrated for developing countries seems to reflect the cross-sectional relationship. And the causal interpretation of this relationship is problematic. In contrast, when we look at the longitudinal relationship, it is predominantly negative, with the exception of transition countries where it's also not positive. There is just no relationship, not significant. So concluding, developing countries seems to be no exception. Also there, growing inequality poses a threat to quality of life. And it seems that on no level of development, increasing inequality actually promotes subjective well-being. Thank you very much.
Any questions?
Well, thank you for your presentation. I just have a question. Do you think could be relevant to take also into account the idea that we have different values between poor and rich countries? Like, for example, survival values. In the poor countries, people have to survive. And finally, you have this kind of fatalism, they just accept. I guess that there is no yellow jacket protestation in this kind of countries, you see?
Mm-hmm.
Do you prefer to answer immediately, or shall I ask the question?
Maybe I would collect a few and then I will answer a few.
So thanks a lot for a very nice talk on a very important topic. I come from the inequality literature, and I am a bit concerned that you treat inequality as an exogenous variable. Mm-hmm. Because for us, inequality is an outcome variable that is determined, for instance, by policies. And of course, the effectiveness of redistributive policy might be affected by other variables that are also affecting subjective well-being. So I'm a bit concerned that what exactly we can learn from this analysis is not precisely clear to me from that perspective. Then again, another comment from the inequality literature. Are you sure that you have income inequality data for the low developed countries? Can it be that these are consumption inequality data and that might explain some of the differences? Because of course, an income in a developing country is not always clearly conceptually defined. And then I'm a bit hesitating to make my last point because it shows my ignorance, but I struggled understanding the statistical inference you do at the higher level of your multi-level model. So That's, I think, what you do, right? You have a multi-level model, and then you have macro variables, and you do statistical inference. Do I have to interpret that as if you have a sample of countries drawn from the pool of existing countries in the world? And then my question is your data that you have like that, is it a random sample? I don't think so. There is selection bias, a bit echoing the question to the previous comment. And is that a source of concern in the interpretation of the significance of your higher level coefficients, which is basically driving your story, right? Because you're interpreting the significance level.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I was just wondering if in your data you can distinguish between okay, this inequality between people at a given moment and the possibility of people change their place in society. Because Taleb, for instance, talks about this, that it is different for us to analyze inequality from a point of view of just comparing who is on top and who is in the bottom, the distance between them, and the possibility of migrating from one place to another. And he argues that inequality might not be as bad if the change is possible. So rich become poor and poor become rich, even if the distance is high, in comparison for other countries where the distance might be smaller, but there is a crystallization of who gets the position. So I don't know if in your data you can do that, but that might be interesting to analyze the effects on happiness, because if I live in a very high inequality country, but where this movement is possible, maybe I feel happier.
Yeah, maybe there's just one I would collect and then I would answer.
Thank you very much. Very interesting topic. Excellent presentation. Well done. Few questions that I wanted to ask, and maybe I missed. Your independent variables at the macro level, what were they? Was it GDP and inequality?
Yes.
Did you check for multicollinearity? I'm sure you did.
Yeah.
But theoretically, they're obviously correlated, which if they are in your equation, it might likely have turned the sign of your poverty or your the relationship between that and subjective well-being. Knowing you, you probably tested it, but I can't think that there's a negative relationship. And if there's a negative relationship, we really have to go into why. What is possible explanations for that negative relationship? There can be some mediating factors which says that with a subsidy that you get, it might be that inequality, which then will look at poverty, is then mediated to subjective well-being, which is income. So in other words, there's some latent variables, confounding variables at play, but the results of inequality being positive related to subjective well-being, we have to investigate that.
So thank you very much. I will answer what I can answer shortly. Francis proposes to account for values, and I think that's a good idea, because there will be, yeah, in a way, my analysis is relative to the macro level conditions of a country, but there is much more relativity there, obviously, and there will be a lot of heterogeneity. So that may be also the source of this heterogeneity across countries, different values. I'm afraid it's not really possible with this data, but yeah, in general, that's a good comment. That's a good insight. Then inequality versus policies. So that's, yes. So I think like the point you're raising is like doesn't make sense to look at effects of inequality in any case. Does it at all? Is it at all a valid question to look at correlates of inequality? If I understood correctly, like you say, like we should rather look at the effects of policies. This is what matters. This is what should be driving our decisions. And inequality that's like not a valid determinant of well-being. And yeah, I think I would disagree probably because like, yeah, also there is like, we're doing this. We are interested in correlates of inequality. So, so yeah, of course, it provides part of the picture. It just like adds one little brick, but I think everything that we do just adds one little brick. About income versus consumption inequality, I don't know. I will need to look into that because you're right. That's a question. About the sample of countries at the macro level, yes, that's in principle, the method is designed to have a sample of countries, but what it does in practice, like in practice, we are using it even though we rarely have a random sample of countries, countryways, and so forth. So we kind of accept that we go through it. And what it does, basically, it corrects standard errors. So like it provides more conservative estimates for the macro level factors. So yeah, but you're right. That's in a way we're kind of going beyond what the method is made for, but that's how we do. That's how we do. And the point about inequality and mobility, I'm not sure whether we can do it with this data. So I don't like, normally we would look at mobility data at like person's occupation or education and the fathers or mothers. We would look at this kind of data. So yeah, maybe I'm not sure, but that's a very good point. Thank you.